This is a reading of Woods Runner by Gary Paulson, Chapter 5. Samuel was just 13, but he lived on a frontier where even when things were normal, someone whose age was 13 going on 30, childhood ended when it was possible to help with chores. For a healthy boy or girl, it ended at 8 or 9, possibly 10. Because of his parents' nature, their lack of physical skill, their joy and gentleness, their love of books and music, their almost childlike wonder in knowing all they could about the wide world, the whole wide world, but not necessarily the world right around them, Samuel had become the provider for his family. As he embraced the forest, his skill at hunting grew. Actually, the forest embraced him, took him in, made him, as the French say, a coureur du bois, a woods runner. Soon he provided meat for nearly the whole settlement, and in turn, the other men and women helped Samuel's parents with their small farm and took over Samuel's chores when he was in the woods. Samuel's knowledge grew until he had heard a twig break. He would know whether it was a deer or bear or squirrel that broke it. He could look at a track and know when the animal or man made it, and whether or not the creature was in a hurry, and if so, why, and how fast it was going, and what, if anything, was chasing it, and how close the pursuer might be. And the more he was of the woods, of the wild, of the green, the less he was of the people. He sometimes enjoyed being with others, and of course he loved his parents, but his skills and his woods knowledge set him apart, made him different. His neighbors in the settlement saw this and they sought him out when they had a question about the forest or about game. They marveled at him and thought he was a kind of seer, one who could know more than others, divine things in a spiritual way. Samuel knew this was not the case. He had just learned to see what others could not. Now he had brought all his knowledge to read sign as he met the day. He was on his feet before the first light broke through the trees. He woke desperately thirsty and went to the creek that trickled past the rear of the cabin and drank long and hard. The water was so cold it hurt his teeth, and so sweet it took some of the taste stink from the evening before out of his mouth. He was hungry, but could find no food that the marauders had overlooked. He would have to shoot something along the way. For now there was nothing to do but read sign and try to figure out what happens, how it happens, and exactly when. He started by circling the cabin, forcing himself to take time to be calm, carefully studying the ground, looking closely at the soft dirt away from the grass. First, he found small tracks from moccasins he had made for his mother. Then he saw his father's prints also from moccasins. The right foot toed in slightly from time. When showing off as a small boy, he broke his ankle jumping from a shed roof. Both sets of prints were in the soft dirt in the front of the door of the cabin in normal patterns they would make going in and out. Then in the dirt at the side of the cabin, more moccasin prints, larger, flatter feet digging deeper, running as attackers came, and still more prints, too many to tell them apart. On top of those which meant they had come later, hard shoes with leather soles and heels, at least 3 men with regular shoes, 2 of normal weight and 1 heavier. On top of all the marks, Samuel saw horse prints, 2, maybe 3 horses, all unshod and being led because there was no extra weight on them. No men in the settlement wore shoes or could afford horses to ride. Only one man had a single workhorse. Others who could afford animals had oxen, because when they became too old or broken to work, they could be eaten. The attack had been fast. They had come up along the creek. Samuel backtracked and found their prints in the soft soil there and exploded out in the clearing by the cabin. His parents were probably outside and must have been overrun with no time to react. His father wouldn't have had the musket close anyway. It was like him to leave it inside when working near the house. Samuel's father had seen bad things happen to other people, but was too good inside, too generous to believe that it could happen to him. He must believe now, Samuel thought. The attack widened rapidly. He saw where Overton and the others had fallen, saw the blood, now covered with flies, where they had been hacked to the ground with tomahawks. It was a mystery to Samuel, though, why his parents had not been killed. He was grateful, but it didn't make any sense. He lost their tracks as he followed the spreading attack. Larger moccasin prints and the shoe prints of 3 men were everywhere. He could imagine the terror of the people in the settlement, the war cries of the attackers mixed with the screams of the victims and the smell of blood and fear and death. He saw where at least 2 of the men in shoes had mounted their horses. Here and there, he found single or double tracks of his mother and father as they were jerked or pulled, the tracks scuffed and misshapen. New tracks joined theirs as other people were also spared, all of them dragged or pushed toward the eastern side of the settlement. Finally, he saw how it ended. The last of the cabins were burned, the surviving victims, probably neck tied to each other with rope, lined up and pulled along the trail. Horses were in front, the attackers split, some in the front, some in the back. There was no indication that any prisoners had been wounded or killed. When it happened? When had it happened? He started following the tracks, which a blind man could have followed. Let his mind work on that question. He left home early that day before moving west until he came to new country, since he hunted out the forest around the settlement. Say by mid-morning, he was out of earshot of gunfire, if anyone had used the gun. All the victims he buried had been chopped down with either tomahawks or war clubs, so the attack could have come mid-morning. That would have been the soonest. If that was the case, then there were just under 24 hours ahead of him, maybe 20, 22. Moving slowly as they would with prisoners, they might make 2 miles an hour. With a rest of perhaps 6 hours, they might have traveled 14 to 16 hours, 24 to 28 miles. He shook his head, probably less. He studied the trail ahead and spacing of the footprints, trying to estimate their speed. They were close together. Even the horse tracks showed they were moving slowly. 20 miles at most, yet still only a guess. But he turned out to be wrong. Later, he discovered that he had forgotten that there was another settlement of 4 cabins 10 miles further on. The attackers had taken their time to stop and slaughter the people who lived there. The British. Generally poorly trained, the British enlisted soldier was also poorly paid, often going months with no pay at all. Poorly cared for, the wounded were virtually ignored and allowed to die alone unless a friend had time to help. Poorly fed, salt beef, dried peas, and tea were mainstays. And poorly treated, tied to a wagon wheel and flogged until his back was shredded for the slightest infraction. And yet, somehow, amazingly, up until the War of Independence, he managed to conquer most of the world. Young British officers in England, when they were being shipped out to fight in the colonies, were told to settle their affairs and make out a proper will, because the rifleman will almost certainly kill you.